What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Brad Mines, your host, and this is episode 30 of the Halving Report. The price of Bitcoin is $9,100 US at the time of this recording. There are 1,409 days left until the next Bitcoin halving. On today's episode, we have the return of the Blockchain Socialist, a leader amongst left-wing blockchain enthusiasts, and the crypto leftist subreddit moderator. Today, I ask him all about U.S. contemporary politics mixed with some cryptocurrency near the end of the episode. Let's get to it.
Yeah, I think last time we spoke a lot about socialism and just the philosophy and your take on it and some of the great thinkers behind it. Today, my questions are a little bit more contemporary, but I know a lot's happened since the last time we've spoke. I think it's been 4 months. Our guy Bernie Sanders is out of the race. COVID-19's gone widespread. We got protests and riots all over the states. So lots to talk about for sure. But I just want to ask, about your website, blockchainsocialist.com, and some of the work you've done maybe since the last time. I think now you've launched your newsletter. Maybe speak about some of the work you've focused on it and why you focused on in the past few months.
Sure. So I think last time we spoke, I was mainly focused on writing articles, and then since then I've expanded a bit to start doing podcasts as well. So I focus mostly on doing interviews with people that I think are working on just projects that I think are interesting from the left's perspective, and or people who are already left-wing and just have some sort of knowledge about blockchain and cryptocurrencies in general. So that now I've done a lot less articles and a lot more podcasts since I started doing that. And I've had a few different interviews. So my most recent interview at least, was with a guy named Rich Jensen, who's working on a project called Resonate, which is sort of like a long story short, basically a cooperatively owned Spotify. So there were some blockchain elements that they were working on. So we talked about his experience on starting something like that, but then unfortunately they had to delay those plans. But it was an interesting talk nonetheless, because we talked a lot about peer-to-peer infrastructure in general. So I think music is just a really good industry to analyze and observe in regards to how the IT infrastructure behind it is set up. So we talked a bit about Napster in the interview, and I think that Napster is a really interesting sort of example of how peer-to-peer architecture really fundamentally changed how music was done at the time. You can look at graphs where the revenue of the music industry in total just plummeted essentially right after Napster came out. It hasn't been able to reach the same amount of total revenue since then. So there's some interesting stuff there. I've spoken to other people who are working on on projects themselves, some pretty big ones, largely in the Ethereum space. So Daniel Kronavet was a guy that I spoke to who was working on Colony. They work on, basically, from what I understand, like templates on the creation of DAOs, which is pretty interesting. And then a woman named Paula Berman, who was working at Democracy Earth, and they're looking at making this sort of novel approach for voting, specifically for kind of like choosing where you want your money to go to. So it's pretty interesting, called quadratic voting. So I've had a lot of stuff like that.
That's pretty interesting. Jumping way back to when you first started speaking, you said you like to get people on the show that they're left-wing people. But I know the last episode you kind of did a segment, not with Eric Voorhees, but with critiquing one of his interviews. Would you ever have somebody on your show from the right?
That is a tough question. At the moment, I think not. I think that there are so many platforms out there that will let them speak that there isn't much use to me speaking to them at the moment. The last episode that I did with Eric Voorhees and critiquing his own interviews and his own political ideas was mostly a way to, break down the way that these type of people think, and to provide just like a critical analysis of it all, because that tends to be just the mainstream thought. So I don't think that having someone who is like, I wouldn't have Eric Voorhees on, probably not anytime soon at least. I don't really see how that would be helpful in terms of what the sort of goals of the project that I'm doing. Like what I want to do is really give a platform for people who are aligned to the left.
It's kind of funny that you say that, because a lot of the times you see conservatives are the ones screaming and yelling about censorship and free speech. Do you see that as well?
Like people censoring like left-wing people.
Well, I mean, you see it on both sides, of course, but I often see people talking, people on the right that are complaining that some of their voices have been censored, like a lot of conservatives are being censored off of Twitter or other social media platforms. Do you think, I obviously see that the threat is to the left. I mean, even see Trump right now, talking about Antifa, which is such a broad. Would you think that's a pretty broad term, Antifa, and like calling them like a terrorist organization?
Oh yeah, I mean that's definitely the danger is that Antifa is not an organized or not an organization really. It's really just a broad movement of being anti-fascist. So it is a pretty dangerous thing for him to be saying that he wants to do, and that is a very clear example of censorship against the left. And there are, a million other historical examples besides that anyway. You can go back to the Red Scare and such, but it is very ironic. You don't hear definitely the free speech people telling Donald Trump that it's a bad thing to try and get at Antifa in some way.
Just jumping back to your segment on Eric Voorhees, and just is there anything that he says or anything that you sympathize with the libertarians?
Sure. I mean, I sympathize with the skepticism against authority and sort of anti-authoritarianism, but I think their analysis of what is authoritarian and what is not is very flawed. Like, there's obviously like an authoritarian nature inherent to capitalism that seems to just fly over their heads a lot of the time. I think that a free market is inherently authoritarian. I mean, it's allowing for those who have a lot of wealth, a lot of property, to be able to impose their own will against everyone else who is a part of this society. So I think that's something that they largely miss out on. Historically speaking, libertarian it used to mean socialist back in the day, before it reached America, when it was a purely European term. In the 1800s, it meant a socialist, someone who wanted liberty against capitalists, against industrialists at the time. And it wasn't until like 100 or so years later, when it came to the US, and it would sort of changed into more of a pro-free market type of ideology. So it's sort of a bastardization of what it was meant to be originally, actually.
The states kind of have a way with doing that with different words and different things, is just taking it and making it completely their own and kind of ruining its original meaning. I feel like that with a lot of things. But yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you. You'll see me liking some of the things that people like Eric Voorhees says on Twitter. Like I do see some of the things he says, and I like what he says. Other times I'm like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And that's obviously when he's being more political as opposed to being more crypto. I like him because he's not a Bitcoin maximalist, where you see a lot of influencers in the space. A lot of them are, in which he isn't. So you'll see me liking things like that. But like back when Bernie was campaigning, I mean, he would be critiquing Bernie Sanders so much, and I'm like, there's all these corrupt politicians. Why are you choosing Bernie Sanders, who's literally wants to reduce government in like military and all these and a lot of wasteful expenditures by the government? I think I even commented on it one time, and he responded, "Oh, he's just going to increase the government in other aspects." Well, I mean, spending your money on machines of war and killing compared to healthcare for your citizens or something like that. I mean, it's just like, how do you not see that? What's your thoughts on that? Did you witness some of that?
Yeah, but I mean that's a very common. I mean, that is like classic right-wing libertarian sort of thought. To them, there is no difference between government spending on one thing versus another. There isn't really much nuance, and it's just sort of anti whatever the government does, no matter almost what it is, except for things that, protect their property. You will not see. I think it's mostly a thing of sort of prioritization, where they prioritize the things that the things that they don't like the most about the state are the things that they don't really care about or they don't see as helping them immediately. So while they would much rather cut welfare spending than the military, because whatever the military does doesn't affect them personally, or doesn't feel like it does. Well, maybe they know someone who used welfare once, and so, or they have some misconception about certain people using welfare. Therefore, it's a much more important thing in their eyes. Even though, you can point to all the statistics and all the numbers about the spending on the military. I think it's just a matter of prioritization, and it's hard to find a right-wing libertarian who's also struggling to make ends meet, let's say.
Well, have you been following the protests?
Yeah, as much as I can. It's about time that it sort of happened in a way. It's just sad it has to happen this way.
Like I've kind of been out of it the last couple of days, but from what I'm seeing, like just massive amounts of people, and it's like spreading all across the world. Even in my local area in Canada here, there was thousands of people marching in Niagara Falls. Luckily, nothing violent has happened here. I mean, what's your take on the violence? Like, some people are like, let it burn. No justice, no peace. Others are taking an opposite stance. I mean, you see police being aggressors in some instances. You see protesters sometimes being instigators of violence in other instances.
I mean, I think by and large, the root of the violence and the rioting is from the police. You cannot, like, how can you compare protesters, I mean, who are maybe throwing rocks or something, versus what is essentially a tiny military in a city? I mean, the amount of weaponry and like defense options that they have at their disposal is just so, it dwarfs whatever protesters have in comparison. And the obsession with whether or not rioting is bad, like, people riot because they have no other outlet to express themselves, to express their anger, and to like let people know, people especially who are in power, that they're pissed off. So I mean, I think that there is justification for a lot of the rioting personally. A lot of these businesses that may get hit anyways have insurance, like they're going to be fine. By and large, most of any type of violence that's inflicted on some building is done to some sort of franchise or some sort of large corporation that exists there. And occasionally, a side effect of that is sometimes small businesses as well may get hurt in the process as well. By and large, it's done to these larger companies. So I mean, I think there was in Minneapolis, I know they burnt down that Target. I think that was actually kind of a good idea. I mean, Target was headquartered in Minneapolis. So I mean, it really pushed people with the levers of power within that city to push for some sort of change. That's kind of how I see it.
What do you think needs to be done by this local and federal governments to appease this massive protest that's happening? Like, you see police reform. Is that enough? Do we need to legalize marijuana or drugs? Like, what do you think needs to happen?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's sort of like all of those things. It's just, I'm no like police expert, so it's hard for me to say exactly what to do. I mean, I think defunding the police is the smallest thing we can do to try and fix the problem, and just change the direction of those funds from the police to services that actually benefit working class people, so that they don't have to go to crime in order to make ends meet. I mean, by and large, crime is a symptom of poverty, and it's a symptom of not having access to the things that you need for life in normal circumstances. So I think those are, it's a start to defund the police. Ideally, I think that abolition of police is something that is possible, but I don't know how possible that is under a capitalist society. Just considering that the function of the police is founded upon the protection of capital and protection of property. The whole reason that cities created their police departments was because it was a service that a lot of industrialists had already been privately paying for. They just privately paid for whoever would break down or break up the strikes that were going on around their factories. So the ultimate root of the police is to protect the property of the wealthy. And I mean, protecting property in general, but like really prioritizing that of the wealthy. It's hard to, I don't know what abolition of the police will look like if we still live under capitalism, but it's something that I'm curious to read more on.
Do you think everyone will have to be armed? Because I mean, that's what I mean. I was kind of reading more about the Second Amendment lately, and the idea was that you'd have everyone was to have like a standing army. But then again, there's so much gun violence in the States, such a problem there. If you don't have police officers, one man with a gun control a lot, right? So is more gun ownership in that picture? Because like you see a lot of people on the right critiquing the left, saying, oh, the same people that are saying abolish the police are saying, want to take away your guns, essentially.
Ideally, it would be that you wouldn't need to have all this weaponry.
Yeah.
I think that on one end, I sympathize with wanting to purchase a gun to feel safe if you see, that you're in danger, or you feel that you are in danger, could be in danger in a country that allows so many guns and so much gun violence in general. It's sort of like, okay, what else am I supposed to do? I don't see it ending very well if everyone is just buying guns. I mean, it's just everyone sort of standing a little bit from each other and like pointing guns with both of the hands, and just like staring at each other, seeing who's going to go first. And it's not a great situation to be in.
Yeah, I guess we'll wait and find out how that goes. Just moving on to COVID-19. We're back. They're calling it, second phase here of opening businesses. Last Friday was, the first opening of bars and restaurants in my city here. Me and some friends went out and had a probably too good of a time. We've been cooped up here for some months. What's your take on America's response to it?
The easy answer, it's pretty shit. It became politicized so early. Donald Trump refusing to wear a mask when he went out, and then it became already there was this environment of sort of lack of trust in health authorities, especially. You have this anti-vax movement and everything like that, which I think is people who are anti-vax are probably also anti-mask. I would bet it was this already existing environment for this to happen, and COVID just sort of exacerbated all of the issues already out there. But the whole reason why states want to stay open, and different politicians and people want to stay open in the beginning, is so that they can keep going about with their business as usual. But really, we're in a situation where, capitalism can't really function business as usual because of this health crisis. It goes completely against any sort of principle of the free market. This is just such a huge externality that it is so obvious that you can't just be going back to normal like this. It would just, unless you are okay with the sacrifice of however many thousands or more of people dying from the virus. So and you do see that. You see people who are like, who cares if a bunch of people die? A bunch of people die every day anyway.
Yeah.
If you're already nihilistic about this stuff in general, then it just makes it easy to there's just a domino effect of more and more into spiral of nihilism and depression almost, in a way. But also people will try to justify it and say, well, how else am I supposed to make money? And that's also partially true as well. $1,200 a month for one payment of $1,200 is not nearly enough to survive for the rest of this pandemic. So it's sort of just a nightmare waiting to happen.
It seems like the state's GOP and Democratic establishment are both blaming China, not only for COVID-19, but for many of their problems. Did you share that sentiment, or what do you think about that?
It's already been shown and proven that China did not make this from a lab or something. So it's not that, it's just something that happened because of probably just unsanitary conditions in some particular area. It's a virus that existed in another animal and it just transferred over. So it's sort of a random sort of event. I don't think that China really there's no point in blaming China, really. Whether or not they could have been more truthful, I don't know, because I can imagine very easily if you're in this situation and you are the governor of this province in China and you don't really understand what is going on, but you don't want to freak everyone out. It's a tough situation to be in. I could believe that as plausible, but I don't think we don't gain anything from continuing to blame China for this. It really feels more like a very easy excuse to basically just to have an enemy, some sort of foreign enemy to stoke fear and to move the blame from the politicians in power in the US to just some sort of abstract idea of China. So I think it's much more of an excuse than it is anything else.
Do you think America's relations with China will improve under Joe Biden government?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I have no idea. I don't really, because yeah, you're right. They have also been trying to up the anti-China sentiment, but they aren't very coherent about it. I mean, in one moment they're happy for China and like congratulate China. In another moment they're trying to blame China for something else. I mean, I don't even know if China relations are really even that bad at the moment under Trump. Seems more like a show than anything else. Nothing has really fundamentally changed as far as I can tell. As Trump may say that more things are being made in the US, I kind of doubt that. China just has such a large advantage, and there are so many business interests in the US in order to have their manufacturing continue in China that China is just playing the game. They're being a good capitalist. They're taking advantage of their cheap labor in order to improve their economy and to develop their country. So it's sort of I can't imagine how it would change so much, but I think China will likely continue to want to increase its influence in Asia and sort of try to slowly push out the US out of that part of the world.
Yeah. Are we seeing the fall of the American empire right now, do you think? Like, we're like, so much is going on down there, I feel like.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if in my lifetime we did see just a fundamental break of all of our institutions, but it's also hard to say because the US is such a hegemonic power that there's so much military power, there's so much economic power that it holds. I mean, the fact that it's gotten this far on like all the problems that have existed for decades is astonishing. I think that part of the reason why we justify the police being so violent towards its own citizens is because of the military presence that the US holds in other parts of the world. The police, sort of violent police, and sort of their ability to get away with almost anything and their like invincibility at times from the law also justify the military occupations that the US holds in various different countries.
Well, I was going to shift gears a little bit and just ask you what you thought about Bernie Sanders ending his campaign, and are you critical of him backing Joe Biden? I mean, everyone kind of expected this, I know, but a lot of people some people are critical of him now.
I think in the first place, we never should have expected that pure like electoral politics is going to get the change that we need in the US. But it was disappointing to see Bernie Sanders drop out at the moment that he did. I think it was a bit premature. It looks like, however, at the time, if I recall, Democrats were still pushing people to go to the polls to vote in person while this pandemic was starting. And then they did that and they sort of blamed Bernie Sanders. Like the fact that he was still in the primary was the reason that he should just drop out because Joe Biden was going to win anyways. I think it would be very different right now, I think, if Bernie Sanders was still in the race. So it's sad, but it's also, it's not unexpected because he did say he would support Biden otherwise.
What do you mean when you said things would be very different right now if he was still in the race?
I think it just, a lot of the things that he had been speaking about throughout his whole campaign would have been a lot more obvious to people. And in particular, an easy one is just the fact that healthcare is tied to your employment. And COVID happened, and then millions of people lost their jobs, and in conjunction with their health insurance. So now that we're in terrible health crisis and people don't have health insurance. So I think that one would have spoken to a lot of people very quickly, and at the very least maybe could have pushed Joe Biden, since he has said previously that he would not pass a Medicare for all bill if he was the president just because of the sheer cost of it, which is absolutely insane to say that in the middle of this crisis. I mean, it's despicable, really.
Do you see this Biden surge in the polls valid, or do you think we're in a situation like 2016, or people kind of underestimating Trump's ability to get elected?
I think there's a good chance that actually it's just Trump is just shitting the bed so much that people are going to vote for Biden just to have something else. It's a voting against something versus voting for something, which is a very weak position to be in. I'm not terribly hopeful, even when Joe Biden goes into office, that any sort of fundamental change will be made, and we would instead just continue this sort of cycle of just degradation of the US afterwards.
Yeah, I don't have too much hope under Joe Biden either. I mean, hopefully Bernie can pull him a little bit in that direction. I do have a lot of hope for Bitcoin this year, I think. All right, so I had Jason Williams on the show. You know who that is?
I'm not sure.
He works with Pomp and Mark Yesko at like Morgan Creek Digital. He's very, very wealthy, capitalist guy, but I don't know, he's definitely interesting guy. But anyways, he was saying like we're going to be testing all-time highs by October for Bitcoin. You think it's going to, supply and demand is going to kind of kick in by then? And where do you see it going in the next year or so?
I don't know. I mean, that's something that I've been thinking about for a while. I mean, part of the value proposition, I think, of Bitcoin and of cryptocurrencies, part of it, I think, is whenever society breaks down, you need some sort of accounting system to have some sort of normalcy of money. So, I mean, it's possible. I still don't know if Bitcoin is a good enough money to do it. That's only like if it actually happens we'll be able to tell, but it's hard. I think it's going to be closely linked to the political landscape. One of the scenarios I kind of fear is that does actually happen, where society is just breaking down and everyone is putting their money into Bitcoin. But now all we have is really the people who own the most Bitcoin are now just like new billionaires. And it's hard for me to imagine, because of the political situation and just like the environment outside of it, whether or not Bitcoin will necessarily provide something better or not. But I think that's only time will really tell.
Well, so some people are saying like if it doesn't go, if we don't see new all-time highs by then, then its thesis is kind of proven wrong, like in terms of what it's done in the past and how it's supposed to work. So I'm pretty optimistic. Like if I were to see it at the same price as it is now this time next year, I'd probably be pretty concerned. Do you see any other projects like more valuable, or do you, like I see Bitcoin as kind of like your safety and probably what new people into the community should probably hold most of. Do you disagree with that, or what are your thoughts?
I tend to I steer away from giving any sort of financial advice. To like investment advice.
So don't people know, like when they see you're involved in blockchain, like people that know you, don't they say, you know, how do I get in? What do I do? Where do I buy? What should I buy? Don't people ask you that sometimes?
Actually, a lot more rarely than you would think. I think that in the left-wing spaces, there is mostly a curiosity, like intellectually, about it all. So most of the questions I get asked are mostly about on like what type of, how should like this, my supposed utopian society, how would that be designed using blockchain technology? Those are usually more of the questions that I get asked, and not so much investment stuff.
So you're probably more interested in Ethereum then, or something like that.
I would say that I'm more interested in like post-capitalist type of projects, and those are generally in Ethereum largely in Ethereum, but I think occasionally in other projects as well. Like there aren't very many. I can't really name a DAO project using Bitcoin. Or like built on top of Bitcoin. Most of the post-capitalist type of projects are thinking of using smart contracts.
Well, that's a big part of why I like speaking with you is because you speak more philosophically about the space and less about price predictions and less about financial advice. And maybe you could just tell us again what your website, where to go, and where to follow you.
Yeah, sure. I have a website called theblockchainsocialist.com. Very simple, and there you'll find all the different podcasts and articles that I've written. As well, you can subscribe to the podcast on most podcast applications, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, things like that. And then I'm also on Twitter at TB Socialist, where I tweet a bunch. And then we also have a community, a subreddit called r/crypto leftists, and as well as a Discord, which you can find an invite to in the subreddit. Those are sort of the goal of this project of mine, is to create this platform for people on the left to discuss about blockchain and how it would be used in a more left-wing context and more anti-capitalist context, and how to take advantage of it rather than using it for purely as a speculative instrument or using it for sort of some other sort of misguided purpose. I believe just make a safe space for that. And as much as that word doesn't like to be used, I think there is a need for a dedicated space for that, because most other spaces are dominated by the right or sort of apolitical and focused on trying to maximize return financially rather than trying to create a better society.
Very well said. Thanks again for coming on to the show. I actually didn't know you were on Spotify, so I just subscribed. So thanks again for coming on. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. It's always great to chat with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Big shout out to the listeners who listened in to the episode today. Please follow and engage by reading the show notes and subscribing to the channel. We'll see you back soon here on the Halving Report.